Great Molasses Flood of 1919, Boston, and the Industrial Revolution. Boston, a city known for its revolutionary past and maritime legacy, had transformed drastically by 1919. The cobbled streets of the North End were no longer just bustling with Italian immigrants, street vendors, and church bells. The once quaint residential areas were now surrounded by the steel giants of industry. Factories spewing smoke, railways carrying freight, and warehouses storing goods that fueled the economy. At the heart of this change was the rise of industrial production, particularly in response to World War I. Boston had been a key player in the war effort, supplying munitions, warships, and materials needed for combat. The city's growth had come with its own challenges, not the least of which was the crowded neighborhoods and an influx of immigrant labor. The demand for fuel, chemicals, and raw materials like molasses was higher than ever, driving an insatiable demand for alcohol production. The North End, historically the heart of Boston's Italian community, was a maze of narrow streets, tenements, and small businesses. Amidst the noise of children playing in the streets, the hum of streetcars, and the daily hustle of immigrant families working long hours in factories, the presence of large industrial plants loomed, serving as a constant reminder of the era's transformation. This was an area that had been shaped by waves of immigrants looking for work, but it was also a place where the dangers of industrialization were becoming all too evident. Factories that once turned raw materials into textiles and shoes now churned out war goods, explosives, uniforms, munitions. Amidst this frenzy of wartime production, one company, the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, USIA, began making headlines for a different reason. Their ambition was to create a vast tank in the heart of Boston, one capable of holding millions of gallons of molasses, a byproduct of sugar production used in making alcohol. But little did the citizens of Boston know that this tank, towering and imposing, would soon become the epicenter of one of the strangest and most tragic events in American history. The United States Industrial Alcohol Company, or USIA, was a relatively new entity at the time of the flood, having been created to capitalize on the booming demand for alcohol during World War I. Molasses, a thick syrup derived from sugar production, was key to the fermentation process needed to create ethanol and other alcohol-based products for military use. Ethanol was a critical fuel source for warplanes, vehicles, and explosives, which made the USIA's operations crucial to the war effort. Boston's North End seemed like an ideal location for such a large operation. The proximity to the port allowed easy access to molasses shipped from the Caribbean, and the densely populated area provided a labor force willing to work for low wages. But the decision to build a massive molasses storage tank in the middle of the North End was a curious one. It was a decision driven by convenience and expedience, not necessarily by safety. The construction of the tank began in 1915, designed to hold 2.3 million gallons of molasses. To say the tank was enormous would be an understatement. It was 50 feet high and 90 feet in diameter, with a circumference so large that it seemed out of place in the middle of a busy neighborhood. The workers who were tasked with constructing it quickly began to raise concerns about the quality of the materials and the stability of the tank. The tank's walls were thinner than industry standards required, and the welds were poorly executed. But these concerns were dismissed by the company, who were eager to meet the demands of the war effort. Boston's North End seemed like an ideal location for such a large operation. The proximity to the port allowed easy access to molasses shipped from the Caribbean, and the densely populated area provided a labor force willing to work for low wages. But the decision to build a massive molasses storage tank in the middle of the North End was a curious one. It was a decision driven by convenience and expedience, not necessarily by safety. The construction of the tank began in 1915, designed to hold 2.3 million gallons of molasses. To say the tank was enormous would be an understatement. It was 50 feet high and 90 feet in diameter, with a circumference so large that it seemed out of place in the middle of a busy neighborhood. The workers who were tasked with constructing it quickly began to raise concerns about the quality of the materials and the stability of the tank. The tank's steel walls were thinner than industry standards required, and the welds were poorly executed. But these concerns were dismissed by the company, who were eager to meet the demands of the war effort. Locals reported strange sounds coming from the tank as it was filled with molasses. Creaks and groans that seemed to warn of impending disaster. But in the rush to keep up with the wartime production needs, no one listened. The company pressed ahead, filling the tank to capacity in the summer of 1918, unaware that this miscalculation would ultimately lead to catastrophe. Part 3. The Day of the Explosion. January 15, 1919, dawned with an unseasonably warm air for Boston. The temperature hovered around 40 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough to accelerate the fermentation process inside the molasses tank. As the molasses inside began to ferment, carbon dioxide gas was produced. This gas, unable to escape due to the sealed tank, built up tremendous pressure. The molasses itself was already under a great deal of pressure, and the combination of these factors would soon prove to be disastrous. At approximately 12:30 p.m., disaster struck. With a deafening roar that could be heard miles away, the tank exploded. The shockwave reverberated through the streets, knocking down buildings and shaking the foundations of nearby houses. The blast sent a massive wave of molasses surging through the neighborhood, racing at an estimated 35 miles per hour. The thick liquid covered the streets, swallowing everything in its path. Vehicles, including streetcars, were swept away, and buildings were flattened under the weight of the molasses. The sheer force of the molasses was so great that it knocked down everything in its path. Steel, brick, and stone buildings were no match for its force. The wave of molasses reached heights of 15 feet, and in some areas it was described as uncontrollable. It poured into alleyways, swept away people who were going about their daily business, and engulfed homes. Pedestrians were caught off guard, unable to escape the sticky flood as it rushed toward them. Some were crushed by debris, others were trapped in the molasses, unable to break free. Survivors described the scene as nightmarish. The molasses was sticky and suffocating. People who had been caught in the flood were trapped, unable to move as they were buried by the thick syrup. The liquid itself was so dense that it slowed down the movement of anyone caught within it. Rescue workers who arrived on the scene found themselves struggling to wade through the molasses, which had formed a viscous, sticky barrier between them and the survivors. The situation was made even worse by the high number of casualties. 21 people lost their lives, and over 150 others were injured, some critically. The flood destroyed an entire section of the North End, leveling buildings and knocking out infrastructure. The chaos of the rescue efforts. As the explosion subsided, the true scale of the disaster began to sink in. The air was thick with the smell of molasses, a sweet, pungent odor that hung over the neighborhood for weeks. Rescue efforts began immediately, but the task was monumental. Firefighters, police officers, and volunteers rushed to the scene, but the molasses was so thick and sticky that it was nearly impossible to move through it. Many of the victims were stuck in the gooey flood, unable to break free. The molasses was everywhere, filling the streets, clogging doorways, and even reaching the harbor.
Oh my God!
The rescue teams worked tirelessly, wading through the thick syrup to pull out survivors. However, The situation was far from simple. The molasses clung to everything from clothing to streetcars to the buildings themselves. It seemed as if the entire city had been coated in sticky goo. Some of the survivors were trapped under debris, their limbs buried in molasses, while others had been knocked unconscious. As night fell, the full scope of the tragedy became evident. The flood had not only caused extensive physical damage, but it had also left emotional scars on the survivors and witnesses. In a neighborhood where community and family were central to daily life, the molasses flood became an event that would never be forgotten. The legal and public outcry. In the wake of the flood, the public demanded answers. Many felt that the United States Industrial Alcohol Company had acted with gross negligence in constructing the tank. There had been multiple warnings from workers about the tank's instability, yet the company had ignored these concerns. The tank had been poorly constructed, with subpar materials that were not strong enough to withstand the pressure it was under. Lawsuits were filed by the victims' families, and the company was brought to trial. Investigations revealed that the company had violated several safety regulations and had failed to properly maintain the tank. Witnesses testified that the tank had leaked molasses for months before the explosion, yet nothing had been done to address the issue. The company's denial of responsibility only fueled public anger. Eventually, the courts found the United States Industrial Alcohol Company responsible for the disaster. They were ordered to pay damages to the families of the victims, but many felt that the company had gotten off too lightly. The molasses flood was a reminder of the unchecked power of corporations during the industrial era, and the public began to demand stronger regulations for industrial safety. The aftermath and long-term impact. The flood had left its mark on the North End, not just physically, but emotionally as well. The cleanup efforts took months, as workers tried to remove the thick molasses from the streets, buildings, and homes. The molasses had seeped into every corner of the neighborhood, and it was nearly impossible to remove it all. The stench of rotting molasses lingered in the air for weeks, creating a sense of unease and discomfort for the survivors. The molasses flood also led to significant changes in industrial safety regulations. The disaster highlighted the dangers of poorly constructed industrial tanks and the need for greater oversight in the construction and maintenance of such structures. The federal government began to implement stricter regulations on the safety of industrial facilities, and the molasses flood became a symbol of the dangers of industrialization and the importance of safety in the workplace. The Great Molasses Flood of 1919 is a story of tragedy, negligence, and the dangers of industrialization. It remains one of the most bizarre disasters in American history, a reminder of the unpredictability of life in a rapidly changing world. While the flood is largely forgotten today, its legacy lives on in the memory of those who lived through it and in the lessons it taught about the importance of safety, regulation, and the human cost of progress.